Thank you so much, Tina. We really appreciate your help and your support. My name is Grace Adeneye, and I will be moderating today together with Emily Cater, who you see on the screen as well. So we will be moderating the discussion as well as the chat. So if you have any questions, concerns, or comments along the way, please feel free to drop them into the chat. This will be an hour-long webinar to learn about strategies for integrating critical race theory into teaching with primary source pedagogy. This webinar is the first part of a two-part event. The second event will be a facilitated hour-and-a-half-long reading discussion that will take place in about 2 weeks, and it'll be hosted by the RBMS Diversity Committee Reading Group on May 27th at 1 p.m. Central Time. So I am hugely, hugely excited for that, and look out for a more official correspondence about that in the upcoming couple of weeks. I do see a question about the webinar's recording. ACRL will send out notification when the recording is available. That's something that we don't control, but we will let everyone know as soon as it's up. So I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our speakers. First of all, we have Jimmy Zavala. He's the teaching and learning librarian for UCLA Library Special Collections. Prior to joining UCLA, Jimmy was the project coordinator librarian for Transforming Knowledge, Transforming Libraries, a 3-year IMLS-funded research project analyzing the intersection of ethnic studies and community archives at UC Irvine. He received his MLIS from UCLA and also holds a BA in Latin American Studies and an MA in History from California State University, Los Angeles. Next, we have Rachel E. Winston. She is the inaugural Black Diaspora Archivist at the University of Texas in Austin. In this role, she leads the university's effort to build a special collection documenting the Black experience across the Americas and the Caribbean. She is an alumni of Davidson College, the Coro Fellows Program in Public Affairs, and the University of Texas at Austin. And last but certainly not least, we have Kellee E. Warren, who is an assistant professor and special collections librarian at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Ms. Warren's currently released article on archival instruction, Reimagining Special Collections Instruction, a Special Case of Haiti, was published in the American Archivist, Fall/Winter 2020. Excessive workload in special collections public services librarianship, challenges, feelings, and impacts, a survey of public services special collections librarians, was published in the Journal of Library Administration in 2021. And her article, We Need These Bodies, but Not Their Knowledge, Black Women in the Archival Science Profession and Their Connections to the Archives of Enslaved Black Women in the French Antilles was published in Library Trends, spring 2016. Ms. Warren's research interests include critical pedagogies, digital humanities, and oral history. I hope you will join me all in giving all of our speakers a warm welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you all have to say.
Awesome. So I think I'll go first. Share my screen real quickly. Thank you for the invitation, first and foremost. And just happy to be here with Kellee and also Rachel and everybody in the audience. Did you just talk about, I guess, critical race theory and the corporation policy primary source instruction? I think it's very important to talk about this right now, especially given the attacks recently on critical race theory in a lot of different states across the nation. And yeah, just thankful to be in conversation and dialogue with all of you here. And just getting right into it, critical race theory is just a very, I guess given the time, for the sake of time, just broad overview of what it is, right? So critical race theory, just some background, right? It emerges from This legal scholarship field, basically critiquing the lack of racial equality, after the civil rights movement, right? So you have individuals like Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, John Stefanchich, Henry Crenshaw, Cheryl Harris, Mari Matsuda, to name a few, that really were analyzing, right, these racial hierarchies, right, and white supremacy in society. And since then, it's really been incorporated into the field of education. Individuals like Gloria Latson Billings, William Tate, Daniel Solorzano, Tara Yoso, Papi Kumasi, also to name a few, really also analyzing the inequality that's found in the field of education, right? And so, I think at the core of curricular actually does two things, right? First and foremost, provides this inquiry to analyze these racial hierarchies, the way white supremacy is upheld in society, right? The way race is a social construct and obviously the implications of that, but also analyzing the way that racism is embedded, within society institutions, and that's not an anomaly. That's like the standard, that's the normal cause. I guess this nation, right, the fabric of this, this country. And so while examining, these racial hierarchies, the way these racial institutions, the way they're organized, the way these structures uphold white supremacy, at the same time, it seeks to do something about it, right? So not just addressing it, not just identifying racism, white supremacy, but seeking to do something to transform it. And so that's really where, it challenges these racial hierarchies and white supremacy, primarily by centering the experiences, right, in the voice of BIPOC, folks, the BIPOC community, to do something about it. And so again, at the core is two things, right? How do we examine these racial structures, these racial hierarchies, and then, trying to do something about it. And so, again, it's just a very broad, background for the sake of time, but I highly encourage all of you to, you read the materials by, these authors, these scholars, Derek Bell and, Gloria Latson Billings and everyone here that I listed, just to name a few, to get more into details of what, really critical race theory, like the different tenets and the core foundations of it. These are just some, resources and archives that have, really written about critical race theory, right? And I know there's a bibliography that has been created. And so these are definitely part of that bibliography for all of you to look at if you haven't, read any of these works. Definitely very much excited for the new edited book that came out, right, by Sophia Long and Jorge Lopez McKnight, that really focused on critical race theory and, incorporating it to just LIS, broadly speaking. So I encourage all of you to take a look at these resources. Um, in terms of incorporating, right, and talking about critical race theory, then, and archival primary sources, I think, when talking about archives and doing instruction, typically one of the things that you want to do is, introduce students to what archives are, what special collections are. And I think that's the point where we can talk about the way that archives, right, and libraries in general have really upheld white supremacy in these racial structures. And ideally, well, not ideal, specifically this idea of neutrality, right? The way that neutrality, this objectivity is a myth in the sense that it just perpetuates and maintains, this white supremacy and these racial structures in power, right? Because what we're really talking about, when we're talking about neutrality and to be neutral, what that really means is that it's just continues to center whiteness, given the fact that whiteness is the norm, right? That's the standard across society. And so when you're not challenging that, you're just replicating these same structures. It's just centering and continue to center whiteness. So I think, going against obviously this idea of neutrality, that, archives are not neutral, that what's collected, the way that things are collected, those decisions are really based, again, on centering whiteness, and really obviously then continuing to perpetuate this neutrality leads to these power dynamics, right? As a direct result of these structures of inequality and exclusion that excludes individuals, BIPOC communities from, taking part in creating this historical record, right, or creating archives, but also exclusion in terms of the stories that do not get collected from, BIPOC communities, BIPOC individuals. So, really, just doing away with this idea of neutrality. I know it's been one of those, I guess, core ideas, right, for a long while, and continues to be so, to do so in archives and library, in generally speaking, but I think it just does a lot of harm to really maintain these structures, power structures, these racial hierarchies are already in place. And so then when talking about instruction, obviously the main tools that we use, right, as instructors of, working with primary sources is archival material, right, or special collections. And I think at the bare minimum, when doing primary source instruction, incorporating critical race theory into it is, being intentional about selecting material that centers BIPOC knowledge, right? And their epistemologies as well. And understanding that I think this, perhaps, skews towards representation, but, and representation is not the end all be all, obviously, of, dismantling, these, racial structures, but it does have an impact, I think, primarily for students, right? BIPOC students who oftentimes, don't necessarily see, themselves represent a historical record, right? What Michelle Caswell, mentions as symbolic annihilation. Um, and it does make an impact in the sense of allowing them to make connections, perhaps, with materials that um, represent and reflect, these epistemologies that don't center whiteness, right? And so being intentional about this, and I think this is a bare minimum, as instructors that we can do, given again that, we're working with these types of materials, and being intentional selecting resources that just don't reflect whiteness, but really these different epistemologies. But also making sure that, when working with these types of materials, that it just doesn't center also violence, like racism and oppression as well, right? Given that, for, BIPOC folks, it's, their experience of more than just, violence or, racism, racial oppression. So including things, aspects such as joy, right? Or material that expresses happiness that allows students to make those connections from that perspective as well. Um, but if you are, using material that, is dealing with racism and with violence, oppression, perhaps giving like a content warning or letting students know beforehand, or even, the faculty that you're working with of the material that you're using, right? To let them know that, okay, um, the types of records they're using, just to make sure that, students are aware, because then, they might be triggered in a negative way. It might bring, it might bring historical trauma, right? And just being cautious of that. So again, being intentional about selecting material that, goes away or decenters violence in this case. And I think taking an active learning approach as well is also very helpful to use critical inquiry, right? I think going beyond show and tell, where students are not looking at material from special collections or archival material that's, at a distance. Because I think for a lot of students who are not aware of what archives are, what special collections is, or even if they are, I think for many of them, special collections, archives represents like this very mysterious thing where it's off limits to them, right? And taking an active learning approach where students are being able to directly engage with the material, like physically handle them, kind of, breaks with those barriers of letting students know that they do have access to this material, right? And that we want them to, obviously welcoming them to use this material beyond instruction, but whenever they have time to do research. Um, and so active learning, besides having students actively, use the records and material, I think typically we're having them work in groups, right? Or at least in pairs, collaborating with one another, where they can learn from each other, right? And I think this goes to disrupting, this like student instructor hierarchy, where, what Paulo Freire Lopez, right, coins as the banking system, where instead of having an instructor, being the authority figure and just providing information to students that students just are receiving without necessarily questioning it, having students dialogue with each other and, create discussions with themselves to really center their knowledge, center their own experiences. And in doing so, I think it provides more of, perhaps as instructors, we see more ourselves as facilitators, and also learning, what we can learn from them as well, right? And I think in doing so, creating this active learning approach, that allows students to engage with primary source material directly, that allows them to work with each other, see what they can learn from each other, and allows them to become these, these knowledge producers, where they're not relying on the instructor, or they're not just taking that information at face value, but, critically interrogating what they're working with, right? Such as looking for biases, looking for silences or gaps, erasures in the archives, and, looking at that through their own lens to see what connections they can make with that, but also bringing in their own experiences at the same time, that allows them to develop these narratives, right? Or, these stories that either challenges what they're working with, the items that they're looking at, or adds to some type of story that, they're looking at in terms of analyzing the information, which leads them to become, these develop these counter stories, right? That's, I think, very pivotal and very important, to critical race theory, that Richard Delgado identifies as, a method of telling stories of those people whose experiences are often not told. And also, I think by centering the knowledge of students and centering their own experiences, and having them critically interrogate, and investigate the resources that they're, working with, it really allows them to then develop these narratives that center their own experiences, challenges a master narrative by complicating an understanding of one single truth by allowing them to bring in multiple perspectives of the information that they're gathering. And again, it teaches each of us about their own experiences as well. And at the same time, in developing these counter arcs, I think self-reflection is important by allowing students to see how they can, become, I guess, intervene in the historical record in the sense of, they're working with some type of material. Well, in what ways can they suggest, more material for, like special collections, let's say, to collect? What would they like to see more of archives? What kind of stories? But also self-reflection and allowing them to understand that they also have some type of power to transform the historical record as well. So they're not just powerless, and when analyzing primary sources, but they have some power and making sure that their stories and their opinions and their voice are being heard, and taking those into consideration as, I guess, as instructors or as, professionals in the field, right? Given that obviously this is a target population, one of the target populations that we're working with, special collections. So I'll leave it at that. Again, this is just kind of broadly speaking, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll turn it over to then, my colleagues over here will take up the conversation. So thank you all.
All right, let me get things going here. Okay, so thank you, Jemmy, for that excellent presentation. It's a good thing I was on mute because you had a lot of nonverbal feedback coming from my direction. Thank you also to the organizers of today's event. It is wonderful to be in conversation with you all. Today, I'm joining you from the original homeland of the Kickapoo, Miami, Osage, and Sioux people. Now, just as critical race theory operates in the understanding that racism is ordinary and pervasive, I want to begin my presentation by acknowledging critical race theory as an effective framework by which to approach our work as librarians and archivists. So accepting this is true, I'll spend my time today considering critical race praxis, which was established in the late 90s as a way to enact the work and understandings achieved through critical race theory. I want to then consider this, a critical race praxis, alongside archives and how we teach with primary sources. So I want to begin by highlighting a publication Jimmy referenced in his presentation. Knowledge Justice is the first edited volume centering critical race theory in LIS. It was published earlier this year by MIT Press and is also available open access by MIT Press. The publication includes 17 contributions from 29 practitioners and thought leaders from across the field, folks like Anthony Dunbar, Tanya Sutherland, Todd Homa, so many others. And as you can tell, I'm excited about this publication, and that is in part because I have a chapter. My Knowledge Justice contribution looks at critical race theory, critical race praxis, and critical archival studies, and situates them within my experience as a Black woman identifying archivist, and considers how we might be able to apply a critical race praxis to archival work. That said, in my chapter, I propose 5 tenets of critical race praxis within an archival context. For those of you able to see my presentation screen, you'll find a slightly extended description of each tenet, but for the sake of time, I will be brief in my explanation. These tenets include disruptive in acknowledging systems of power, racism, and privilege, responsive in addressing current archival and social issues, actionable in centering social justice, informed in the inclusion of various knowledge systems and self-reflective practice, and caring in the commitment to minimize harm for collections and professionals. Now, at this point, I want to think a little bit more about instruction pedagogy and how that might operate within this framework of critical race praxis in archives. I get really excited about instruction and working and learning alongside students in the archive, and I'm sure many of you can relate. Typically, and this is of course when we're not in a pandemic, I work with students in one-off sessions and lean heavily on visual materials given the brevity of our time together. So in the next couple of minutes, I'd like to use an image from a postcard collection found in my library special collections and imagine how an archival critical race praxis approach might be engaged in its instruction. This postcard is one of roughly 20 included in a collection titled Missions in South America and the Caribbean. The details included in the catalog entry for this collection are minimal, but I can share that these postcards originate around 1930 and were mass produced. Many of them can be found today, like right now, via online sellers at relatively accessible prices. With that, it's easy to presume these were acquired by my library by a seller or private collector. And for context's sake, I will add that in 1946, 15 years after the date written on the lower left-hand corner of the postcard, French Guiana moved from being a French colony to a department of France. Okay, so looking at this image, there is so much to unpack. And for me, an instruction exercise begins with a collective reading of the photograph, specifically from the perspective of those we see. Then, considering an archival critical race praxis, there are particular conversations that would be important to include. First, creator's intention. This postcard is a product of a colonial project in what was then French Guiana, and as the handwritten message on the backside suggests, and you can see a small image of the back in the lower right-hand corner, this postcard was in fact used for the purpose in which it was designed, being to showcase the Black subjects in a way that extols the work of missionaries. Be that as it may, we're now able to use this document in a way beyond the creator's intent. Secondly, language and access. The catalog entry and collection description does not include any language signaling to the humanity of the presumably young women captured here merely as subjects. And I will mention that there have been a lot of thoughtful conversations in the field about redefining what gets labeled as an ethnic or a Black collection. And of course, those thoughts are relevant here too. But bringing us back to language, or lack thereof, language can act as a barrier to access, especially for those coming from or looking to know more about communities that have historically been marginalized and oppressed. Thinking through these layers of language, discovery, and access in an instruction setting can help students develop the tools they need to navigate archival research. And lastly, moving beyond the collection, resituating this document within the context of the world experienced by those pictured opens up the door for more conversations about the kinds of documents needed to better understand or tell their stories. And certainly these conversations can inform research initiatives and collection development activities. So to summarize and conclude, in our teaching, direct conversations about provenance at all levels, at the level of the institution down to the actual document, can reveal systems of power and privilege and open up the conversations we have in the archival classroom setting. Additionally, mindful descriptive practices and an ongoing commitment to reparative redescription can improve access to collections, particularly for those most at stake. And finally, in centering those who are documented as the other, we have the opportunity to promote and train in the practice of counter storytelling, of reading against the creator's intention to recognize the humanity of those the record chose to objectify. So I thank you all for your attention, and Kellee, I turn things over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Jimmy, for setting the stage for me. Thank you to our facilitators, Grace and Emily, and thank you for ACRL for hosting this webinar. So let me see if I can get this tech right. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to further sort of drill down on what Jimmy and Rachel presented and talk about critical race theory in the special collections classroom, talking about a specific critical pedagogy and referring to self-reflection, something that we should be thinking about doing after we have these sessions that involve critical pedagogy of your choosing. I tend to choose a pedagogy that's called culturally sustaining pedagogy, which also has some elements of culturally relevant pedagogy. Jimmy mentioned Gloria Ladson Billings. She is the expert in culturally relevant pedagogy. And so I will talk about culturally sustaining pedagogy in just a moment. So a lot of people like to look at data. So I kind of want to set up my brief presentation talking about a little bit about the data, just so we can drive this point home. Today, white teachers, elementary school teachers are about 88%. We know that it's pretty white if you're in a college, liberal arts college, or a university. We have white librarians in general at 85 to 86%. Academic libraries, you usually have a higher percentage of white librarians. In fact, when I describe what I do or talk about, talk to other special collections librarians of color or Black special collections librarians, I often say I'm a miracle because it is very difficult to enter the field as a person of color or Black person. So we have white teachers, white librarians who also teach, and then we have a multicultural student body. We have monolingual curriculum, monocultural settings. So that means white, middle class curriculum. In government, broadly speaking, we had No Child Left Behind with George W. Bush, which then sort of turned into the Race to the Top program with President Obama. We also have a testing culture, and everybody should be kind of familiar with that. I grew up with what's called the Iowa tests. I'm a little old, so I don't know if, if the rest of you, if the name changed, but that was one of the things, I started out in a private school, and so it was kind of a culture shock when I entered public school that it seemed like they slid a Scantron right in front of me like the first few weeks that I was in public school. So in US education, generally speaking, they use a deficit approach to teaching culturally different students. Now, what we would want is more of a global approach. And generally speaking, this would be an approach that would be good for all students, including white students. So that would be multilingual, multicultural, teaching to and through students' cultures. Another scholar in education, her name is Geneva Gay. And then also sort of using a cognitive justice framework. I will get a little bit into that a little later. Okay, so as Rachel and Jimmy mentioned, this takes acceptance of, some propositions that are from critical race theory, which is that we have systemic problems with education and memory institutions. Cultural heritage and memory institutions shape what we know and how we teach. The curriculum is a cultural artifact, and that default, as I mentioned, is white, middle class, heterosexual. So that predetermines marginalized students as deficient. We also need to recognize that students and others, so if you work for a public university like I do, so community members that come in and use the materials and we educate them, they possess their own knowledges and their own episteme. So what I focus on and what my research is centered on is basically this sort of expansion of culturally relevant pedagogy, and it's called culturally sustaining pedagogy. So culturally sustaining pedagogy calls us to develop a teaching philosophy where we really commit to learning about who we are teaching and include that knowledge in our practice or learning objectives, if you need to be more specific. Questions often arise, say if an archivist or special collections librarian manages a more homogeneous collection. So for example, I'm thinking of the Swedish collection on the north side of Chicago. We can't say that these groups haven't come into contact with other groups, other cultures in the history of that group. So it's up to us to sort of do the background research and figure out, even if we have to bring in secondary resources, you know, or our other colleagues at these different institutions in order to highlight these points of contact. And then also to another point I wanted to make is that oftentimes these sort of homogenous groups benefited from the mistreatment and the oppression of marginalized groups. So they are in those collections, but it may take some work to locate them, and that's our work. Okay, so culturally sustaining pedagogy. So the two scholars who sort of expanded on culturally relevant pedagogy are Django Paris and H. Sami Alim. Their backgrounds are in education, anthropology, and sociolinguistics. So I am promoting my work. So what I say here is culturally sustaining pedagogy challenges the issue of the dominant curriculum as cultural artifact by calling for instructors to embed themselves in the communities in which they teach and to integrate that cultural knowledge into their instruction. And the interesting thing about this, it's a lot broader than that. So I suggest, you know, looking deeply, reading more deeply, but basically it's embedding yourself in your community. And if your community, going back again, I'm going to repeat stuff. If your community is more homogenous, because I've had questions like this come up during other conferences, then it's your duty to bring in those other knowledges from different cultures. So, oops. So instruction, expand how you teach with primary sources. So there's a term, cosmos of knowledge, that is from cognitive justice, which means that I often try to include different knowledge systems in my instruction sessions, which is not too difficult if you start out with, if you're working with a discipline faculty member and you request their syllabus in advance. So you can kind of look and see what they've assigned depending upon the course. So the course could be, you know, an ethnic studies course or something like that. But for example, there's one professor that I work with that teaches a history of theories in feminism. And so I look, and you don't necessarily have to share this with the instructor, but I sort of look, unless you're collaborating with the instructor, but some, you know, discipline faculty, they drop off their students as if we're a babysitting service. So then you have a little bit more flexibility and freedom. So basically you look at the syllabus in advance, you see if there are any sort of pockets, gaps missing, and then you try to fill those in with, you know, marginalized collections or any sort of secondary content that you can add to the session. So this is an example that I frequently use when I talk about sort of including, making sure that you think about including different knowledges, is that one of the main collections that we have and largest collections that we have is the Hull House collection. I did not know much about settlement house history in Chicago. I did know about Ida B. Wells. I did know about Jane Addams, but you know, the whole movement of settlement house history was not familiar to me. So anyway, We have quite a few sessions. It's a very highly used collection. And so what I started doing, even though we don't have any primary sources related to Ida B. Wells, we maybe have a pamphlet here or there, but we don't have the collection. The collection is actually at University of Chicago, which is a private institution. But basically, I can bring content in because they were contemporaries and they actually knew each other. I can bring content into my session about Ida B. Wells. So that's sort of the simplest way that, simplest example that I can offer to you all. If you have questions, you can always email me. But this is the basic framework for sort of including a different way of thinking and being into your session. Okay, where are we at with time? I'm so sorry. Because I want to leave time for questions. And I told Jimmy and Rachel that I see what time it is. Okay. So another important component is the self-reflection part. So what I generally suggest to researchers is that they have an instruction journal. So you can start this journal, and I know that it's a lot of time. People don't have a lot of time. I don't have a lot of time. But there is sometimes that little space, especially when you're experimenting with a new pedagogy or a new approach, that you can create a reflection journal about your sessions. So if this is new to you, I suggest, buying that journal and sort of reflecting. If you have other colleagues that would like to join you, I was actually, and I don't mean to toot my own horn, but I presented to my colleagues in main reference in my library, and the head of reference decided to take this approach. So basically all of her liaison librarians are doing a self-reflection journal and trying to figure out how to incorporate culturally sustaining strategies in their instruction sessions. Okay. So I think I'm going to wrap that up because I want people to have time to, you can have a look at the screen. One of my critiques often is that people, when I do presentations, people always ask me, librarians always ask me, what books can I buy? What books can I use? And we've been through this over COVID and some of the racial uprisings that we've had. People have bought books or ordered books and not picked them up. But we really need to look at our personal lives as well as our professional lives and sort of open up our networks in both our personal lives and our professional lives. If you cannot think of more than one Black friend or one Latino friend or, any of the number of the identities, then you probably should work on that as well. But this is an article that was from 2014 about the network, social networks of whites. And this is still available at an organization called PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute. And so I'm going to wrap it up from there. If you have any questions, just contact me directly.
Okay. Thank you so much to our panelists. I encourage you to download the comments because you have lots of love in the comments. And the love keeps coming in, lots of thank yous. Anyway, that was wonderful and inspiring. Thank you very much. It's a great way to spend a Friday. One question has come in. I'm seeing lots of thank yous coming in. One question for Kellee, but please, audience members, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we will do our best to keep track of them. So Kellee, have you been able to collaborate with archivists at the institution that does have the Ida B. Wells papers? Do they have anything digitized online?
They actually do have, not the documents, but they have a pretty good collection of images, and that's where I, borrowed that image from. There is I will put the link in the chat. We have a resource, we have a consortium in Chicago that is called Explore Chicago Collections. And yeah, I mean, somebody put the U Chicago, but there's also Explore Chicago Collections, which will give you access to more collections around Chicago. I don't know what just happened to my thing. Anyway, it's called Explore Chicago Collections. I will put it in the chat. So that's the thing. I know a few people over at the University of Chicago, but that's sort of the difference between working in a public university institution and a private institution. And I don't mean to say that in non-COVID times, U Chicago is open to the public. Yes, but it's my understanding that you would have to make an appointment. You know, you have to make an appointment with us, but in pre-COVID times, you didn't, you know, the access levels are quite different. And I do have some judgments that I will not go into here. Thank you, Stephen. There it is. Explore Chicago Collections link. I don't know what happened to my webpage. Anyway, so yes, resources, beautiful images of Ida B. Wells available on Explore Chicago Collections. You know, after things die down a little bit, you could probably request an appointment if you would like access to those.
Great, thank you, Kellee. And this is another one, but if the other panelists do reflection journals, I think you can answer too. Could the reflection journal be something that the students do as well as an assignment / reflection for the class they're taking, or do you think there's more of a benefit to having it be private? Let's see, does that make sense?
That doesn't sound clear to me. And one of my suggestions was that, you know, for an activity that would sort of empower students, and if you wanted to do a critical race theory centered session, would be like a class zine. So if you just didn't have, if you only had 50 minutes, you could actually, you know, have them do sort of a document analysis, but then have them create one page of a class zine. So that, and then they wouldn't necessarily have to walk away with that zine. You could come to some sort of agreement with the instructor and deliver the printed zine to the class after it's all, you know, put together.
Great, thank you. This next question, it says that this presentation is called Integrating Critical Race Theory and Teaching with Primary Sources, but isn't the concept of primary sources inherently patriarchal and thus in conflict with critical race theory? Isn't one purpose of critical race theory to demolish traditional notions of primary sources? I invite everybody, our panelists, to engage with that one.
I can get us started. That is such an astute comment. And yes, right, for a lot of us working in an archive, a traditional archive is a colonial project. And so recognizing that, I think also provides those of us who are recognizing that and really trying to operate in that space, there are actions and circles of influence we have to push back against that. Be the history may be as it is, but our institutes, for a lot of us at universities, right, these institutions are a part of campus. There are good things that happen, right, important things and operations that happen, and so even given the foundation, we can make our do our best to make our institutions the best that they can be, especially in service to the collections and the students that we're working with. So yes, but it's kind of my answer to that.
I think also, you know, thank you, Rachel, for that. Also talking to students, you know, when doing instruction that, you know, what is archival or what is considered, you know, like an archival material, archival collections, right? Where again, yes, addressing these issues, but also letting them know that, what something, well, I guess what something is considered a primary source or an archival item, that it's not, might be different to communities, right, who are not necessarily represented, right, in these academic institutions, or thinking of different ways that, they think of what archives are in their own terms, right? So it's also, yeah, so continue to question, right, that, definition of what constitutes an archive, or what archival material is, but also acknowledging that, whatever, collections, institutions have, this is not all of what archives are, and that changes, right, depending on the context, but also the communities that you're engaging with.
Okay, and I will add my 2 cents. It is definitely, layered on top of what Jimmy and Rachel said. It's both and, because we have to really think about the fact, and this is our work once again, that there is what I call conscripted knowledge. There is marginalized knowledge within those official manuscript collections or official, rare book collections. So it's our duty to sort of, when we're selecting materials for our instruction sessions, that we sort of try to look for that knowledge and excavate that knowledge from our collections.
Thank you all. Our next question is, I'm curious about the extent to which the presenters may or may not reference critical race theory when working with faculty. Do you find it productive to name this approach explicitly, or do you just kind of do it without formal discussion? I'm thinking it could be a growth opportunity for some faculty as well, or we could learn from them.
That's a great point. For me, my approach, I like to be about it. So I don't necessarily name critical race theory or critical race praxis, but I make that part of how I operate in my actions, in my role. So I could name it, that certainly is an opportunity, but I tend to be more focused on kind of operationalizing those thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, I think it's the same for me, where I typically just, before doing instruction with faculty, come up with agenda, letting them know the different talking points, or, we're going to go over covering class. So it's always, I think being intentional about, addressing, the sciences, right, in archives, or, marginalization in archives. So there hasn't been any, I guess, backlash, at least, in my experience in working with faculty, whenever they see, I guess, that this talking point is going to be brought up, or that I'm going to cover it. But yeah, I think, like Richard said, just being intentional about it, I think always helps, for sure.
Naming is power, but pedagogy is a teaching philosophy. So basically, we don't have to approach, unless you feel comfortable with your discipline colleagues or discipline faculty. You don't have to say, hey, I use critical race theory pedagogy for, no, you just incorporate these things into your practice.
This is a related question. This person says, as a librarian at an institution where faculty tend to lead instruction sessions rather than library staff, how do you suggest we navigate a situation where faculty is not interested in incorporating critical race theory into their primary source instruction sessions? Any strategies on that?
I've heard this question in a similar way. I tell professionals, professional librarians, to get those sources in any way that you can. Like I said, you don't have to say, articulate like, this is what I'm doing and this is what I picked this source for, and, or this is why I picked this part of the collection. You get those sources in any way that you can in front of the students. because it's definitely going to help. You know, if you have 30 students, it's definitely going to help 10 out of those 30 students. They are going to come back to you. They are going to email you, and they are going to want to visit the library, you know, after COVID.
All right. Let's see. I wonder if panelists could talk a little bit about format diversity and critical race theory and critical race pedagogy. I do find that I'm able to identify counter stories or just basic BIPOC representation in ephemera, periodicals, photos, rather than rare books. Does anyone else find that to be true or?
Well, when I can't, and I don't, y'all chime in here, when I can't find something in rare books, I often have to remember that rare books are pretty broad now, that you can use artist books to sort of supplement that when you're trying to use rare books. So, and generally artist books that are created by people of color and Black people, that's how I supplement if I can't find anything in my rare book collection.
I want to visit a really excellent point that Jimmy made about not just highlighting violence and trauma. So to be completely honest, most of the records I encounter in my work are related in some capacity to slavery on a global scale, right? And there's a lot to learn from that. I've had a lot of really intriguing conversations with students, a lot of powerful sessions with students, but also understanding that the Black experience lives beyond slavery. And so how do you find those moments in a documentary record of joy, of humanity that exists within kind of the scope that most of the documents originate from? And that takes work, and balance is important for me. So if I am showing, you know, colonial decrees about slavery, I'm also trying to complement in other ways. And maybe the compliment isn't direct, maybe as a more contemporary record, kind of calling back to what Kellee was saying, to have different types of things in conversation with each other. But that balance is so important as a practitioner for my own well-being, and then also for students, to not just kind of collapse the idea of, okay, slavery and archive. For me, that's important.
I think also keeping in mind that if it's, you know, perhaps if, you know, an institution doesn't have, you know, these, you know, collections that can center, you know, BIPOC knowledge, I think you can still, you know, and again, this is critical race theory, right? So, you know, like inquiry, you can still, you know, interrogate why that is, right? So you still questioning, you know, the reason why there are, you know, few, you know, collections or materials that don't center, you know, BIPOC people, right? And why that is. And I think that perhaps allowing students to then, if you're working with students, I think that's where they can intervene, you know, maybe in a way where that kind of self-reflection is, right? Well, what would they like to see more of, or asking them what kind of materials they like to see more of, that can then, you know, perhaps, you know, influence, you know, collection development, right? Or take it to whoever is in charge of that in your departments, and allowing them to really let them know that this is what students want, given that, you know, this, you know, you're working with students primarily, right, as part of, you know, instruction. So it's still, you know, you can still obviously incorporate, you know, these, you know, inquiries in critical race theory even without using, right, or having this material, because at the end of the day, you know, what critical race theory does is you're investing in that whiteness, right? You're investing in white supremacy, so it still works.
Great, thank you guys. So the next one we have is from a student, and they say that I was wondering if you have any advice for students who want to encourage their professors and instructors to implement critical race theory into their teaching.
You go first.
Oh, sorry, Rachel. I wouldn't do that. If there's anything that we've learned over the past year since we've went into quarantine and have come out of quarantine, is that I wouldn't do that. I would simply, librarianship, let's just get this out of the way here. Librarianship is a lot of work. I don't think you want to involve yourself in that kind of labor. So if you teach a session and a disciplinary faculty actually approaches you and says, hey, I think what you're doing is great. Let me know, tell me a little bit more about your approach. Then I would definitely engage with that discipline faculty, but I wouldn't necessarily right out of the gate say, this is what I'm doing, and this is how I approach materials, or, try to sort of, I go back to the example of me presenting to my colleagues. They were really amenable to that because it is a part of my research. But I did have a white visiting colleague who approached me after the session. He's no longer with the university library, but he did approach me after the session, and he said, well, how do you know that everybody wants to know about what you're talking about? And for me, he, sort of exposed himself. He gave himself away. So you can never be quite sure. You just need to, if you're interested in incorporating these types of, things into your practice, then I'd say start out with that, start out slowly. That's my opinion.
I'll jump in here. I remember being in grad school and having very similar thoughts. And like Kellee said, I chose not to direct my labor on trying to encourage faculty to change, but rather use my position as a student to explore those ideas. So I probably cited Anthony Dunbar's piece in like everything I wrote in grad school. So if it's not being offered to you, look to see where you can create that space for yourself to engage different disciplines, different thought processes, so that you yourself, when you are out in the field, being a practitioner, a thought leader, have that foundation. Lead by example.
Okay, we have 2 minutes. And I'm going to just give one last one because I like this. How are you engaging with the political backlash against critical race theory? Any advice for elementary, middle, and high school teachers?
That's very difficult. And to respond to in such a short amount of time, we actually do host, under normal circumstances, we would host middle school and high school students for the history fair that they have, the National History Fair Day that they have annually. And for some reason, we don't have any issues incorporating that. I know that it's more difficult. I've been in meetings with librarians that are like from Texas. And Texas has a whole like curriculum, right? Rachel knows they have a whole entire curriculum where it's not easy to sort of, incorporate materials. But, even if you have to sort of bring in maybe outside stuff, there's a lot of material that's been digitized. There are digital collections that you can squeeze in if you have access to a computer lab for the kids. But I always say my last point is that get it in any way that you can, even if it's one digitized primary source.
And I think that's a great place to end. We could be here all day. I see 56 more messages in the chat. There are lots of questions. I hope that this sparks more conversation and more conversation. A reminder to everybody here that ACRL's, you'll get an email if you registered and with a link to the video of today's session, and it will also be posted on ACRL's YouTube page or site. Anyway, thank you so much to our panelists and to our hosts at ACRL, and I will say goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much.